Talk Ava. Learn English with confidence.
Today's conversation is about two English words that look very similar at first, but the emotional feeling behind them is surprisingly different. We're talking about advice and suggestion. And honestly, this difference becomes much easier to notice once you hear them inside real situations instead of dictionary definitions. I already feel slightly nervous because I think I use those two almost randomly. In my head, they both just mean giving someone an idea about what they should do.
That's how many learners see them in the beginning.
The basic meaning overlaps, but emotionally they don't feel equally heavy. I noticed this recently because one of my friends was having a serious relationship problem, and another friend responded with, "Can I make a suggestion?" The sentence sounded strangely light for the situation. That's interesting because I probably would not notice that immediately. I just think the person was trying to help. The person was trying to help, but native speakers often feel emotional weight inside these words automatically. In a serious emotional situation, many people would naturally say, "Can I give you some advice?" Because advice sounds more emotionally invested. So, suggestion feels lighter emotionally? Usually, yes. A suggestion often sounds more optional and less emotionally serious. Advice sounds more personal and emotionally involved. I think I can already feel that difference a little. Advice sounds like the speaker really cares about the outcome. Suggestion sounds softer and less emotionally committed. That's a very good instinct. Some English words carry emotional seriousness, and native speakers react to that feeling even when they don't consciously think about it. This topic already feels deeper than vocabulary memorization. It feels connected to relationships and emotional tone again. A lot of natural English works that way. By the way, welcome to Talk Ava. If you enjoy learning English through real conversations and realistic situations instead of textbook examples, you can subscribe and continue learning with us every week. I'm already thinking about situations where I probably used advice and suggestion incorrectly without realizing how different they sounded emotionally. That happens constantly because learners usually focus on literal meaning first. Let's compare a simple situation. Imagine two friends trying to choose a restaurant. One person says, "I have a suggestion." That sounds completely natural because the situation is light and low pressure. Yes, that sounds normal. Nobody's life changes because of a restaurant choice.
Now, imagine the same person saying, "I have some advice." Suddenly, the sentence feels heavier emotionally. That's true. It almost sounds too serious for something small like dinner plans. That's because advice usually carries emotional investment or experience. Suggestions often feel lighter and more optional. I think suggestion sounds like offering an idea, while advice sounds like offering guidance. That's a very natural way to feel the difference. Let's move into another situation. Imagine someone thinking about quitting their job because they feel unhappy every day. If a friend says, "Can I give you some advice?" the sentence feels emotionally supportive and serious. Yes, because quitting a job is a major life decision. Advice feels appropriate there. Now, compare it with, "Can I make a suggestion?" That still works, but emotionally it sounds softer and less emotionally involved. The second version almost sounds more careful emotionally, like the speaker doesn't want to push too hard. That's an important detail. Suggestions usually leave more emotional freedom for the other person. Advice often sounds stronger because emotional responsibility feels heavier. So if someone asks for advice, they're usually asking for deeper help or experience. Very often, yes. Imagine a younger person asking an older relative about career choices. Saying, "I need your advice," sounds emotionally serious because the speaker values the other person's experience and judgment. But saying, "I need a suggestion," sounds much lighter. It almost sounds like asking for random ideas instead of meaningful guidance. That emotional difference matters a lot in natural conversation. Native speakers quietly hear seriousness level inside these words. I think learners sometimes choose advice because it sounds more advanced or intelligent, even in situations where suggestion would sound more natural. That happens very often.
Learners sometimes accidentally make situations sound emotionally heavier than intended. Let's imagine another example. Suppose two coworkers are discussing presentation colors for a meeting. Saying, "I have a suggestion" sounds normal and collaborative.
Yes, because the topic feels practical and flexible.
Now, imagine saying, I have some advice about your presentation colors.
That suddenly sounds more serious and slightly more authoritative.
That's because advice often carries emotional authority or experience. Suggestions sound more equal and open.
I think this explains why advice sometimes feels slightly personal, too. It sounds like the speaker emotionally cares about the decision.
That's very true. Advice usually sounds emotionally invested. Suggestions often sound emotionally lighter and easier to reject.
Rejecting advice feels emotionally harder somehow.
Because advice carries emotional weight. If someone gives heartfelt advice and you ignore it, the situation can feel emotionally sensitive afterward. Suggestions usually don't create the same pressure.
That's fascinating because the actions can look similar from the outside. Both people are technically offering ideas.
But the emotional seriousness changes completely. Let's compare another pair. Can I offer a suggestion? Sounds soft and polite. Can I give you some advice? Sounds more emotionally direct and involved. I think native speakers probably choose between them very carefully during emotional conversations. They do, especially in friendships, relationships, and family situations. Emotional tone matters a lot more than learners realize in natural English. I already feel like I'm going to start hearing emotional weight inside these words now, instead of hearing them as simple vocabulary synonyms. What makes advice and suggestion interesting is that sometimes the situation stays completely the same, but the emotional pressure changes depending on which word you choose. That's the part I'm noticing more now. Earlier, I thought they were just different ways to express the same basic idea. Now, the emotional feeling changes immediately when I hear them. Let's take a situation many people experience. Imagine someone is thinking about quitting their job because they feel exhausted every day. One friend says, I have a suggestion. Another says, I have some advice.
The second one sounds more serious emotionally. It feels like the person is speaking from experience or concern instead of casually offering ideas. That emotional seriousness matters a lot. Advice feels personal. Suggestion feels optional. That line explains the difference really clearly because suggestions sound easier to accept or reject without emotional consequences. Exactly. Suggestions often leave emotional freedom open. Advice can feel emotionally heavier because it sounds more invested in the outcome. I think advice also sounds more connected to responsibility somehow. That's very true. Advice often carries emotional responsibility because the speaker sounds more committed to helping or guiding the other person. Let's imagine another situation. Suppose someone has unhealthy study habits and keeps failing exams. A teacher says, I'd like to give you some advice. That sounds natural because the situation feels serious and the teacher has experience. Now, imagine the teacher saying, I'd like to make a suggestion. That sounds softer and less emotionally heavy. It feels more like a possibility instead of guidance. Exactly. The meaning is close, but the emotional pressure changes completely. I'm starting to realize that native speakers hear seriousness level inside vocabulary much more than learners expect. That happens because native speakers learn words inside emotional situations, not isolated vocabulary lists. Let's compare another example. Imagine someone talking about health problems. If a close friend says, Can I give you some advice? The sentence sounds caring and emotionally involved.
Yes, because health conversations usually feel serious emotionally.
Now compare it with, can I make a suggestion?
That sounds lighter and more careful emotionally. It almost feels less emotionally risky.
That's a good observation. Suggestions usually sound safer socially because they create less emotional pressure.
So if someone gives advice, it almost feels like they emotionally stand behind what they're saying.
Very often, yes. Advice sounds more connected to belief, experience, and emotional investment. Suggestions feel more open-ended.
I think that's why ignoring advice sometimes creates emotional tension afterward. Ignoring suggestions usually feels less serious.
Exactly, because advice emotionally matters more to the speaker. Suggestions often feel easier emotionally for both people.
This topic feels much deeper than I expected, honestly. It feels connected to authority and emotional closeness, too. That's because emotional authority changes tone a lot in English. This is where learners accidentally sound too serious sometimes. I think I've definitely done that before because advice sounds more intelligent in my head.
Many learners think that way. Let's imagine a workplace situation. Suppose coworkers are discussing a PowerPoint presentation. Saying, "I have a suggestion for the slides," sounds collaborative and relaxed.
Yes, that feels normal and low pressure.
Now compare it with, "I have some advice about your slides."
That suddenly sounds more serious and slightly more authoritative.
Exactly. The second version sounds emotionally heavier because advice often suggests experience, judgment, or concern. I think suggestions sound more equal socially, while advice sounds slightly higher in authority. That's often true. Advice can sound emotionally or socially stronger, depending on the situation. Now imagine a dating situation. Someone says, "Can I give you some advice about your relationship?"
That sounds emotionally serious immediately. It feels like a deeper conversation is coming. Now compare it with, "Can I make a suggestion about your relationship?" The second one sounds softer and more careful. It feels less emotionally intense.
That emotional intensity matters a lot in real conversations. Native speakers choose those levels carefully depending on emotional closeness and seriousness.
I'm noticing that advice often sounds emotionally connected to consequences. Suggestions don't always carry that same feeling.
That's a very strong observation, because advice usually appears in situations where outcomes matter emotionally. Suggestions often appear in lighter or more flexible situations.
So choosing between these words changes how emotionally involved the speaker sounds?
Exactly. Let's test another example. Imagine someone choosing coffee flavors in a cafe. Saying, "I have a suggestion," sounds completely natural, because the situation is light and casual. Now imagine someone saying very seriously, "I have some advice about your coffee choice." That suddenly sounds dramatic for no reason. That's because advice increases seriousness automatically. Native speakers emotionally feel that extra weight, even in small conversations. I think learners sometimes accidentally create emotional drama by choosing heavier words than the situation needs. That happens constantly, because learners often focus on vocabulary strength instead of emotional appropriateness. But natural English usually depends more on emotional balance than difficult vocabulary. I'm realizing that real fluency is hearing emotional pressure inside words, not only hearing direct meanings. That's the deeper level many learners eventually discover. Once you start noticing emotional weight inside vocabulary, conversations begin sounding much more natural and much more human. And honestly, now advice and suggestion feel emotionally impossible to confuse because the seriousness difference suddenly feels very obvious. I think one of the funniest things about advice is how quickly it can make a situation sound emotionally serious, even when the topic itself is completely small. I already feel like this is going somewhere dangerous. A few days ago, one of my friends stood in a cafe for almost 5 minutes trying to choose between vanilla and caramel coffee. Then she turned to me very seriously and said, "I need your advice."
Exactly. Advice sounds heavier because emotions are heavier. Native speakers feel that seriousness automatically. I think learners often choose advice because it sounds stronger and more advanced, but we accidentally increase emotional pressure without noticing it.
That happens constantly. Let's compare these naturally. "Can you give me a suggestion for dinner?" Sounds casual and flexible. But "can you give me some advice about dinner?" suddenly sounds emotionally strange unless the situation is unusually serious.
The second version almost sounds like the person has a deep emotional crisis connected to food.
That emotional intensity is the key difference. Suggestions sound emotionally lighter and easier to reject. Advice sounds more emotionally meaningful.
I'm realizing now that advice also creates a feeling of trust sometimes. If someone asks for advice, they usually respect the other person's experience or judgment.
That's very true. Advice often carries emotional trust and responsibility together. Suggestions don't usually carry that same emotional depth.
So asking for advice can sometimes feel emotionally vulnerable too.
Very often, yes. Imagine someone saying, "I need your advice about my relationship." That sounds emotionally personal immediately.
Because the speaker is emotionally opening the situation to the other person.
Exactly. Now compare it with, "I need a suggestion about where to travel this summer." The emotional weight becomes much lighter. That sounds more playful and flexible. Rejecting travel suggestions would not feel emotionally serious. That emotional flexibility matters a lot in English conversations. Native speakers often choose words based on emotional pressure level, not only meaning. I think this topic explains why some learner English sounds unintentionally intense sometimes. We hear vocabulary strength, but native speakers hear emotional seriousness. That's a very important realization. Now let's move into more natural real-life situations, because this is where native speakers quietly manage emotional pressure all the time. Real situations make these differences much easier to feel naturally. Good. Imagine two coworkers discussing a new project idea during lunch. One person says, "I have a suggestion for improving the presentation."
Exactly. A suggestion offers an idea. Advice carries emotional weight.
I honestly think this topic changed how I hear conversations completely, because now I notice emotional seriousness inside vocabulary choices.
That's a very important shift, because native speakers constantly adjust emotional pressure through vocabulary. They're not only choosing meanings, they're choosing emotional distance too.
I think learners sometimes accidentally sound emotionally intense because we choose heavier words, thinking they sound smarter or more fluent.
That happens constantly. Many learners believe stronger vocabulary automatically sounds more advanced, but native speakers often react more to emotional tone than vocabulary difficulty.
So, natural English is not only about sounding intelligent, it's also about sounding emotionally appropriate for the situation.
That's one of the deepest parts of fluency. The emotional weight behind words changes relationships, comfort, seriousness, and conversational atmosphere.
I'm also realizing why native speakers often soften conversations carefully. Softer language probably protects emotional comfort.
Very often, yes. Native speakers manage emotional pressure naturally during conversations, especially in friendships, workplaces, and emotional situations.
This topic honestly feels more connected to psychology than grammar now.
Language and psychology are deeply connected because people emotionally react to tone before consciously analyzing vocabulary definitions sometimes. I think that explains why some conversations feel emotionally heavy even when nobody says anything openly aggressive. That's because emotional pressure can quietly exist inside vocabulary choices. Words like advice, expect, and even should can increase emotional seriousness very quickly. I feel like I'll probably notice these emotional levels every year now, especially in movies and real conversations. Once learners notice emotional weight, it becomes difficult to ignore afterward, because conversations suddenly sound much more human and emotionally layered. I want to test myself now because I'm curious whether my instinct changed naturally during this discussion. Good idea. Imagine your friend is struggling to choose a university course. What would feel more natural there? I'd probably say, "I have some advice if you want to talk about it." That situation feels emotionally important enough for advice. That sounds